All right, folks, it is time for another episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday. We need to make a mold of this moray eel mug, and I'm in the midst of a content creator's dilemma. The dilemma is the complexity of this mug. I have spent hours figuring out my parting lines on this form, deciding how I want to separate this mold, and now I've got to decide, do I have the mental bandwidth to film the process while actually doing the process? It would be really easy for me to just make the mold and not film it. In fact, I did that for the last few mugs. I don't think I captured the molding of the starfish mug, and maybe not even the mug before that. I don't think I did the cassowary. I don't know. Why don't I do it? Because making molds is stressful and difficult, and filming the process kind of adds to that stress. But I think I'm going to try a bit of a compromise on this Tiki Technical Tuesday. As you can see, I've already started the process. I've made my mold chair, I've done a bunch of measurements, and I've figured out my parting lines. And what I think I'm going to do is just check in with you every so often throughout the process. I'm not going to film everything, but I'll try to film most of it, maybe some time lapse, maybe some other things, and I'll definitely keep you up to date as I hit major milestones during this mug making process. To begin with, I'm going to be making some coddling boards. These are the walls that go on the other sides of this, because in the past, I usually would start with the face first like this, set the mold chair down like that, and mold that first. But this is an odd shape. It's going to demand some odd maneuvers on my end, so I want to mold the top section first. I'm making the coddle boards out of some 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood. Now, I don't know if this is actually Baltic birch because you can't really get that anymore, but it is a very high grade of plywood because I want it to be very flat and I don't want it to warp while I'm working with it. I then put these clamping rails on the sides with super glue and some brad nails to hold them in position. These little bump outs are for the clamps to grab, which you will see later. And I think they also add a little bit of stiffening and strengthening to the whole assembly. Now, before I clamp these coddle boards onto the sides, I want to get to the lower section of this mug because I know it's going to be difficult to get to this later. And I'm going to be filling in some areas, mostly under the chin here, and then again under the tail on the back of the mug. And these are sections that will eventually be part of the base piece of the mug, the bottom piece of the mug. So this clay will eventually become plaster. It's really complicated. It's hard to explain. You'll just have to see it happen as this mold takes shape. I'm using an oil-based clay called Sculptix by Chivant, and I'm using this specifically because I want it to kind of hold up as I pack in some water-based clay on top of this, building up the other mold sections. I want this to be non-damaging to the actual sculpture itself, but I also want it to be a little bit durable. And I'm also being extremely careful about not putting any undercuts in. This is going to be a section that's going to pull away from the other mold pieces, so I've got to make sure that the surfaces are smooth. I've really thought through the planes on this, and it's not going to bind or lock up as I add mold pieces to this whole adventure. All right, it's time to switch clays. I'm moving to a very soft water-based clay to build up the rest of these mold walls. Now, like I said, we're going to do the top piece first. We want to mold the top section of this mug first. So I'm going to make the box. I'm going to make a box using those coddle boards that we built earlier. And I'm going to fill in some of that space with some extra styrofoam that I have lying around, just because I don't want to pack this entire void with water-based clay, because that's a lot of clay. So once I got the clay mostly pushed in there, I want to make sure it's really packed in well. Plaster is heavy and it has a way of finding any gaps that it can. So every time I add a little bit more of this water-based clay, I make sure I really push it down with my fingers and really pack it in there. Once I get to the planned height of the mold piece, I then go through with some rake tools and really smooth out my surface and refine my surface. I'm looking for a smooth, clean surface that nicely follows my planned parting line on the top of this mold. Now, you're probably looking at that weird gray thing coming out of the top. That is going to be the pour spout. So that's going to end up being a hollow spot in the top of this mold. The weird thing about making molds is you've got to just picture things in a 3D space that aren't even there right now because we haven't made them yet. We haven't poured the plaster, but we will. You'll see what I'm all talking about shortly, I promise. All right, folks, let's pour some plaster, shall we? Now, the key with pouring plaster is you want to go in a steady, small stream. I want to let the plaster just slowly flow over the surface of the model, and this way you really avoid capturing air bubbles as you pour. Now, I'm going to fill this thing up most of the way, and then I'm going to just make sure it's not leaking. I'm going to give it a little walk around, and I will also be tapping the table to get rid of any air bubbles. It helps to kind of move any air bubbles that are in the plaster up to the surface. But the thing I'm really looking for in making sure is not happening is that the plaster is not dropping. If I see the plaster have a little the plaster level dropping, I know that there is a leak somewhere. Maybe it's leaking out of the side of the mold box, or maybe it's leaking into some sort of void in the clay that I don't know is there. But fortunately, I don't see any leaks. I actually walk all the way around the whole mold box to make sure it's not leaking, because you don't want to hashtag plaster disaster. But happy to report that the first piece poured beautifully. Okie dokie, it is crazy early in the morning, but that's okay because I got up early specifically to get as many mold pieces cast today as I possibly could. Oh, good morning. It is painfully early, and we're going to try to get this prepped, if not poured, before breakfast, the next piece. We'll see. At least prepped. First thing we're going to do is smooth out the top of this plaster. When you pour the plaster, it can kind of have a domed top, and there might be some ripples or bubbles on the top. So I'm going to just go through here first with the shore form, and then with a bunch of other scrapers, and then finally with this nice little steel, kind of spring steel scraper I have, because I want the top to be as flat as possible. I'm looking for a nice clean mold. If I've got a bunch of divots or bumps and stuff like that, those will just catch clay and slip later, and it'll just make casting overall more difficult. Once I got the top flattened out, it was time to remove the coddle boards, which means taking off the clamps and then setting the boards onto the side. And then I'm going to actually tip the mold over, because we're going to be pouring, well, I guess it's the front face part of the mold. It'll be the face of the moray. I'm doing the face first because I want to make sure that I don't bump it or nick it or mess it up later on in this molding process. So I like to do the most intricate part of the sculpture first, if I can, when making molds. We're going to be repeating the same kind of process on each section of the mold that we make. Remember, we started up by packing a bunch of clay in there. Well, now we're going to remove all of that clay, but not all of it. I want to make new parting lines, and I'm going to be following the lines that I drew on my model, and I even have a little line on the board there. You can see just a hint of the line on the board. And that's what I'm going to use as my parting line. It's kind of a guide that I use. And now it's just a guide. I'm full disclosure, I kind of flub one of the pieces later on in this process. But it's good to have those parting lines there as a model for you to follow as you rebuild these mold walls. So here I am packing the clay back in after I've removed all the extra clay. And you can see there was even a little bit of saran wrap there. I did wrap some of this model with saran wrap just to kind of keep it clean, because I know that, the clay can be a little difficult to remove. Not too difficult, but a little bit difficult. Anyway, I put the coddling boards back on. Coddling? Oh my gosh, I don't know. I think they're called coddle boards. I don't know. I just call them mold wall boards. I don't know. Anyway, we put them all back on and get ready to pour plaster. Again, you want to just use a nice, steady, slow stream of well-mixed plaster when you're filling up these mold pieces. And because this piece had a lot of tricky detail in it, like the deep line along the mouth and the detail around the eye, I actually went back in with some canned air and very lightly blew the plaster into those crevices and details. Now, I don't want to blast air in there because then I'm going to introduce air bubbles. I am just gently blowing into the spaces. Some people will use a straw and just blow in air with a straw using their lungs, but I had the canned air there, and that's what I used. Once that was done, you just fill up to the top and watch it for leaks to make sure that that plaster level is not falling. All right, it's time for breakfast. I'm going to watch this for a minute, and then it's time for breakfast. I will actually set a timer on my watch for a minute or 2 minutes just to make absolutely sure that there is no dropping of that plaster level before I walk away from a freshly poured mold. All right, we're back at it and ready to pour the third piece of the mold. Now, the nice thing about making molds like this is the more pieces you make, the faster they go, because the plaster part that you just poured becomes the mold wall for the next piece. So you have to spend less time making clay walls. Anyway, we're going to repeat a lot of the actions. Again, I smooth out the top of the mold. Then I rotate it so that the next piece that we're going to be pouring is facing up. I pull out all of the old clay that's in the way. I remake the mold walls, and we pour the plaster piece. If you're wondering what's in that little spray bottle that I'm spritzing the top of the freshly poured plaster, it's a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, and it breaks the surface tension on the top of the plaster, and it pops any air bubbles that are kind of hanging out on the top of the plaster after they rise up to the surface of the freshly poured plaster. Wow, I just said plaster a lot in that sentence. An hour later, the plaster has set and it's time to move on to the next piece. And things are going faster now, like I said, because we're using that freshly poured piece as one of our parting lines, as one of our parting walls. So we don't have to make that many clay walls anymore, which is quite nice. What do we have to do? Well, we have to remove all of that old clay and set up any new parting lines that are necessary before we pour part, what are you on, part 4? All right, I have not been checking in as often as I should, but I'm really cranking and trying to get this done. And I really just want to stay focused on the mold. I'm about to pour a piece, what is this? 4 of 6. And I really want to get all of the parts poured today. Today is Thursday. We are going away for the weekend. It is our anniversary. Denise and I have been together this year as a couple for 35 years. So we want to get out of here and celebrate. I don't know how many years we've actually been married. I'll put that graphic up here. I'll figure the math out later. Right now I'm focusing on this. But yeah, I want to get all of these parts poured so that the plaster can just set while we're gone over the weekend, which means I've got to start pouring plaster right now. With that deadline in mind, I put the cardboards back onto the mold and mixed up some plaster and started pouring. Now at this point, I actually captured the beginning of a plaster disaster on camera. Now, I didn't see this plaster disaster, although you can see the corner of the plaster level is starting to drop, the corner closest to me, but I did hear it. I heard some dripping sounds. So what do? You grab some water-based clay that I always have on hand for just this kind of emergency. I don't panic, and I just push that clay into wherever I see plaster seeping out of the mold. You always got to listen for drips. We have successfully navigated a micro plaster disaster and we are back to pouring. And of course, it just goes back to normal. We fill this up, we tap things to make sure that it is all settled and there are no air bubbles. And then we have to keep one more thing in mind because we're pouring a big plaster piece against another big plaster piece. When you cast big blocks of plaster against other freshly cast big pieces of plaster, it can be tricky. You'll see the plaster level start to drop a little bit and you might think there's a leak, but what actually is happening is the moisture is getting wicked out of the plaster you just poured by this porous plaster block here. It's like a little sponge absorbing all the moisture. So I like to always overfill the piece because it might sink in just a little as that moisture gets pulled. And like I said, I'm just going to keep an eye on this for a minute or so to make sure that nothing awful is happening. So far, so good. Yeah, we'll just watch it for a minute, but after that, I think we're ready for lunch. All right, we're going to pour part 5, and part 5 is perhaps one of the easiest pieces to pour because we don't have to mess with any clay walls. All of the walls for this part are made up of either plaster pieces that we've already poured or a cottle board, which is quite nice. Now, there's one thing that I realize I haven't mentioned yet in this video, even though if you have an eagle eye, you probably have seen me doing it, and that is the application of mold soap. I want to cover every single plaster piece that we have done. Once the plaster is set, I put on 3 coats of mold soap. It is a release agent that prevents the new plaster pieces from sticking to the older plaster pieces, and it is essential. My favorite mold soap is called Pure Lube mold soap, and I will put a link to it in the description of this video. All right, this is it. It is 3:35, and we are going to pour the last piece on the mold. Well, I'm going to clean this up, and then we're going to flip this over and pour the last piece. The last piece will be the bottom of the mug. I'm so glad I got all these parts done. Well, I don't want to speak too soon, but things are looking good. All right, we've got 5 successful mold pieces poured, so you by now are very familiar with the drill. What are we going to do? We're going to level out and smooth out and clean up the piece that we just poured, and then we flip that mold over and get it ready for the final piece. Okay, last piece, always my favorite piece because it involves no clay. All of the walls are going to be made up of boards. We're just going to use boards for all of it. As I'm sure I've talked about throughout the editing on this piece. Did I talk about it? Oh yeah, we've mentioned it. Yeah, I thought I would. Yeah, as you work your way through the mold, it just goes faster. It wasn't an optical illusion. It has definitely gone faster the further along we've gotten because I only have to usually add 1 clay wall instead of putting 2 clay walls up. It makes it very fast. Alrighty. Perfect. Okay, so I just got to do a little bit of cleanup on this bottom, and then we have to put release on it. Release is critical. I am using the Pure Lube mold soap. It's fantastic stuff. I'll put a link to it in my notes for this video. I'm so relieved to be at this stage. You have no idea. I couldn't get to sleep last night. I was just thinking about this mold. Just lying there looking at the ceiling, thinking about different ways how I wanted to do this. It's a stressful process. It's a process that I am proud to be able to have the knowledge to do, but I don't think it ever gets easier for me per se. Each mold is always a new challenge. There's new shapes. And I learn something every time I make a mold. It's funny. Big's studio, he's a mug maker. He just shared that he was making a mold of something, and he 3D prints his models. So he's got a resin model. And I was jealous of him today because after I set up one of these parting lines, I was like, man, maybe I should have done that a little differently. But I'm committed. I have my model stuck in here and the model's kind of trapped. There's no way I'm going to be able to redo this mold. But he can reprint his model and do the mold differently if he doesn't like the way the mold casts, which is pretty cool, I gotta say. I am jealous of that. Someday I'll learn 3D sculpting. Someday. It's on my to-do list. So I'm removing the little like clean clay areas that I filled in at the very start of this project, and I did the second one before we poured. I think it was the second to last piece or the last piece. No, it was the second to last piece. And these sections that I removed out of this clay will become part of the bottom piece, in theory. Another thing we need to do is add some keys. I am using a rounded router bit to drill some very shallow round keys in the bottom parts of these mold pieces. These are going to let them line up and lock into the bottom piece that we're going to be pouring today. And when I do this, I let the drill go extremely slow, and I don't make them very deep. You don't need them to be that deep at all for them to work well as a key. Once the keys were in place, the boards went back up, and I put release on everything. I put release on these boards, I put release on the plaster, 3 good coats, and I wipe it off in between coats and kind of get a nice polished, waxy surface onto both the wood and the plaster. And then I'm going to fill in all of these extra voids with I'm using a Chivant. It's the Chivant Sculptex clay. And I use this to kind of fill any gaps in between the wood and the plaster, and in the joints where the two boards come together. This is just to make sure that plaster does not leak out. And the last thing I'm going to do is put these little extra keys in the form of these little squares that you're going to see. I think I put 4 of them in here. And these are going to be pry points that are going to let me open the mold easily using mold pliers. Now, I do have a thickness in mind for this bottom piece, and I put a little pencil line. You can see there's an arrow and there's a little pencil line, and that's the thickness. That is my target that I'm going to be filling this plaster up. I don't need to fill the plaster up all the way to the top of these boards. The boards are much higher than I actually need. And then, of course, the alcohol at the end to get rid of any surface bubbles. All right, we did it. 6 pieces, 2 days, well, like a day and a half. I don't know. I can't believe that I got through 5 parts in one day. I'm extremely exhausted. I'm going to go in, even though I'm tired, and get my exercise in for today. And then I will pop back into the studio, open this up, just so that I don't have the coddling boards on over the whole weekend. And then next week, we will pop this mold open. An hour later, we zip back into the studio, and yes, just like I said, we pull those boards off. The moisture in the plaster will warp the boards if I leave them on overnight or any longer than they need to be there, so it's a really good idea to get them off and just let that plaster breathe. And then I can also at this time take in the absolute disaster area that my studio has become during mold making. It's such a mess, but it's done. It's Monday. I am back from an amazing anniversary weekend adventure with Denise. This mold has been sitting here over the weekend and it is ice cold to the touch. Why is it ice cold? Well, because the water in this plaster has been evaporating into the air, and that evaporation is cooling the plaster, which would be fine if the model inside wasn't sculpted in wax. Because it's wax, it's going to get firmer the cooler it is, and I don't want it that way when I open up this mold. I want it to be nice and soft and pliable so that it doesn't cause any resistance when I try to pry this mold open. With that in mind, I'm going to put this mold into the kiln room next to a kiln and do a bisque firing on some mugs. It just so happens that I had a whole bunch of starfish mugs ready for a bisque fire, so I loaded up the kiln and then set the ice cold mold next to it with the hopes that I could warm things up a bit. The next morning, the bisque firing was done. The kiln room was very warm, but I was feeling, to be honest, a bit under the weather. I still had to get this mold open. It was nice and warm now. The timing was perfect. So I cleaned up the work area as best I could and got ready to pop open that mold. Now, this is always a very stressful occasion. You never know how it's going to go. So I'd like you to all just collectively cross your fingers for me, and let's all hope for the best. Oh, that's a good sign. The top lifted right off. I barely even had to apply any pressure. That Pure Lube mold soap does an incredible job at releasing the plaster. I rarely, if ever, have things stick together when I use that release. All right, let's just hope that the rest of the mold comes apart as nicely. I should mention right now that that's a rubber mallet. That's not an actual like metal hammer. It is rubber, and I'm just kind of knocking the mold gently to hopefully... Oh, it's going. It's going. Oh, this is fantastic. You can see just the faintest separation between what will be the big central like top piece of the mold and all of the rest of the pieces of the mold. It's just like a hairline crack that I can see is appearing between the mold sections. There it is. Look at that. So this is why I want the mold nice and warm and the clay to be relatively soft inside, because I want it to just kind of squish and pull as I'm trying to open this mold. If it was ice cold, it would be like a rock inside of this plaster. Look at that. This is great. It's coming apart. Okay, I couldn't help but fast forward a little because this is taking a while. I am definitely not rushing this step. I don't want to break anything, but it's coming. I can see the gap getting bigger and bigger, just steady pressure, and then lo and behold, I finally get a second piece off of the mold. It just kind of, I can just feel it wiggle free, and there we go. Piece number 2. So we got the bottom piece off, and now we have this piece off, and hopefully things will start to go a little quicker. This is the piece that I wish I could redo. It's very thin. It's a tricky one. I should have had a different angle on this, but we're gonna make it work. We're gonna make it work. Very relieved. That's right, I had food poisoning. So after that incredible video of me popping open the mold, feeling happy, excited, relieved, I was kind of waylaid for a week in bed feeling awful. I did feel slightly better yesterday and made all of these. These are the silicone masters for the new mug. Inside of these is that mold that we popped open. Did I film this process? No, I didn't, because one, making silicone molds is stressful in itself. It's the most expensive material I handle here in the studio. And two, I was still feeling pretty sick and I barely had enough energy to get these done. But today we popped them open, we cleaned them up, and we cast the first production molds. And hopefully this video will end with us casting a new mug. We'll see. Let's all collectively cross our fingers and hope that we can get there together. So I am still feeling a tad sick, so I did not film too much of the process, and I apologize for that, but we did get these silicone molds opened, cleaned up, then I mixed up a bunch of plaster, and we cast the first set of production molds. Let's just kind of jump towards the moment where we start to pop them open. Okay, it's the afternoon on the same day, I guess. I've got them all poured, they have set, and I am just about to tuck into the trickiest piece to remove. I hope I can get this open without breaking it. I think I talked about this earlier. It's the one piece that I wish I did differently. It's a little too long, narrow, and thin for my liking, and it's going to be really challenging to get out of here without breaking. I don't know if I take this piece out first and then tackle the tricky piece, but maybe that will make that one break. Oh boy, I just don't know. First casting is always a learning experience. Now I did cut this open. We got it! That makes me so happy. Okay, let's get this other one out. Every mold is different, and you kind of have to learn the best way to cast and demold every new mold when you make them. So it's going to take me a while to figure this out, but eventually I do get this piece out of the mold, and I'm able to cast the remaining, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces, and put them all together. Just like you have to learn how to cast a mold, you also have to learn how to assemble a mold. They do have kind of an order of assembly. The pieces generally will go together in reverse order of the way that they were made when you made the master mold. So I kind of had to learn how to stick this one together. Fortunately, all the pieces fit together very nicely, and I am so satisfied with the very first production mold. All right, I have got the mold in here in the kiln room under a fan, and I have got a bunch of stuff bisking. There it is right there. And it's going to stay there for like 3 or 4 days, at least until it dries out enough for us to be able to pull a casting. So I'll check back with you then. All right, several days have gone by, and I do believe this mold is ready to go. How do I know? Well, I'm going to use this very advanced scientific technique of putting my cheek against the plaster. If the plaster feels cool to my cheek, it is still wet, but if it feels like room temperature, then it's ready to go, and this mold is ready to go. So I'm going to fire up the slip table in what is perhaps the most dramatic sunrise slip table shot I have ever filmed in any episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday, and we are going to pour some slip into this mold. I let this slip dwell for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and then it's time to flip the mold over and dump out the extra slip. We've built up a nice layer of slip on the inside of the mold now, and then that mold needs to sit for an additional 2 hours before the great moment of truth, the opening of the very first casting of the Mini Moray Mug. I usually have about a 50% success rate with first castings out of a new mold, and I am so delighted that the Mini Moray first casting turned out great. I hopped right onto seaming it. That is the process of removing all of the lines left by the 6 pieces of the mold. And once I was done with the seaming, we have this, the very first glaze test AP casting of the Mini Moray mug. All right, that brings us to the end of our mold making adventure, where you see the magic of going from an original sculpture to a mold to a final casting. I'm so relieved that the casting turned out, and I am so in love with its size. I think it looks great in the hand, and it's gonna shrink a little more, which I'm very excited about. It'll be another 12%, so I can't wait. What's next? Well, I'm gonna cast a whole bunch more molds. I wanna end up with 10 production molds, and I've gotta figure out glaze. Denise and I just spent the last 45 minutes thinking about what glazes would work best, and I am dreading making a final choice. Glazing is tough, but that is an adventure for another episode. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this mold making adventure, I'll put another mold making episode up over here, and then I'll let YouTube pick something for you to watch. Thank you. I hope you have subscribed if you enjoy Tiki Technical Tuesday. And if you've got any questions, put them in the comment. I love questions. I'm a question guy. I love answering questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday.